So we wanted to talk to Phil because there's been a little bit of a controversy over there at Grace Community Church because they're doing very controversial things like congregating,
having church,
and worshiping and singing. So do you want to give us a little rundown on what's going on over there, Phil?
Yeah, when the quarantine began, we were like everybody else, listening to the news and thinking, man, there's going to be bodies stacked like cordwood in the streets, and we need to do something. So when they instituted the original quarantine, you remember it was 15 days to flatten the curve, and we did the math and said 15 days at the most, that'll be 3 Sundays we can't meet. So we said, yeah, let's cooperate with this quarantine and we won't have church. And then the 15 days became 30, and that became 3 or 4 months. And finally, the governor of California released all of that, and people started to come back to Grace Church. And then within days, he reinstituted the quarantine and specifically named churches in the list of institutions that he wanted shut down. And at that point, we said we were having hundreds of people meeting in the worship center, our main auditorium, and we hadn't had any problems. I have to say, throughout this entire quarantine, I only know personally one person who died from it. He was a man in his 90s who lived in northern Italy. So it never felt like our congregation was in grave danger, or that the extreme measures they were taking really were warranted by the things that we saw happening around us. And so when they reinstituted the quarantine and put churches under lockdown for the second time, our elders met together and said, really, does the government have legitimate power to order us to stay closed? Actually, the word they used was indefinitely, and it was pretty clear that the governor intended to maintain the shutdown through the end of the year, because you remember they announced that even the Rose Parade is canceled this year. So all mass gatherings, except for political protests, have been, formally forbidden. And so our question was, does Caesar really have that kind of authority over the people of God to say you cannot meet for worship? And after quite a bit of discussion and prayer and studying what the scriptures have to say about it, we said, we're not going to close the church. We're just not going to close the church. People need to be taught, and they need to worship. They need to meet together. We need the fellowship. People were desperate to come back to church, and it's where the hearts of our people were. And so we said, you know what, we're just going to continue to meet. You can come if you want to. If you feel obliged to obey the quarantine, you can do that. But we're going to have a sermon and worship as we usually do. And the crowds began to increase to where last week there were 6,000 people there for one service. I think it was probably, outside of when we have a shepherd's conference and a bunch of guests come, this is probably the largest crowd we ever had for a single Sunday morning worship service. And I'm sure you saw the clip where John MacArthur introduced it by saying, welcome to our peaceful protest, because it seems peaceful protests, don't ever meet with any kind of government interference. So,
did you consider wearing like a Black Lives Matter shirt or carrying some kind of Antifa flag?
Yeah, burn a cop car.
We had talked about protest signs and stuff like that. Not seriously, but yeah. I mean, there's also a large tent, a massive tent that takes up most of the main parking lot, and it was full as well. So we had a full auditorium indoors and a full tent outdoors. It's really quite an amazing thing, and a testimony to how the people of God just sense the need for fellowship and congregational worship.
Have you had, what's the blowback been on that? I know there's people that they see you simply like a picture of you on the internet with your family out in public, and you don't have a mask on, and they take that opportunity in Facebook comments to be like, "Where's your mask?" So have you had that? I'm sure you're getting like that times a million, right?
Of course. Cancel culture canceled me a long time ago, so it has no effect on me. But yeah, the truth is most of the blowback we've gotten has been from people online. the sort of people on Twitter who the people who put the twit in Twitter. They're the ones who just sort of relentlessly post these shrill, shrieking comments about how we're killing people and all of that, which there's simply no truth in any of that. We've been meeting now for 8 weeks. For at least 8 weeks, there have been hundreds of people, 8 weeks consecutively, hundreds of people in the worship center every Sunday morning. And I've not heard of a single person who tested positive for the coronavirus because they were there. It just hasn't resulted in the sort of outbreak that the media and scaremongers seem to want us to think is inevitable. So we're going to keep doing it.
Yeah,
there is a risk, of course. There's a risk. There was a risk 3 years ago during the flu epidemic. We face this all the time in the church. And in fact, anybody who's ever had kids in the nursery knows that that's the petri dish for every kind of, flu or common cold or sickness. It happens. And we've never stopped going to church because of it before. So it just seems like the current shutdown is just a gross overreaction.
Yeah, I had a bit of a realization this last week. I was visiting my father, who doctors have given about a year left. He's had dementia. He's got growth on his brainstem that they don't know when they can't operate on it. So the family just got together and we wanted to be together because it could be the last time. So I'm there I got my brothers and sisters, there's about 5 or 6 siblings there, and my stepmom, and my dad can hardly talk. He used to be a real talker, he just talk your ear off, and now he can't really talk. He just he can say a word or two now and then. I'm just sitting there and we're just all kind of hanging out together. We're not talking much, but it's what we needed. We needed to be in the same room together. We needed that to be in each other's presence. It was worth driving or flying all the way up to Seattle, then driving a few hours out to the middle of Washington just to sit there and be in the same room. Zoom couldn't have accomplished that, and there's something that happens when you're in the presence of other people and we act like it's not that big a deal. Like Zoom meetings can replace it. And it's just not true.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, that's, I think, one of the harshest parts of the toll that the quarantine has taken on people. If your father was in a hospital, you wouldn't be able to visit him. You'd have to die alone. Or if he was in a nursing home, he'd be locked down with no visitors. And the emotional toll and the spiritual toll that takes on people is unbelievable. Mm-hmm. During the quarantine, I've had occasion to do some funerals. People in my fellowship group have died, none of them from the coronavirus, but from other causes. Mm-hmm. And it's tragic. Not only were they forced to die alone in most cases, the funerals have been almost non-events. There is, I don't know if the rule is still currently in place, but a few weeks ago, I did a funeral graveside service at Forest Lawn, and the rules they have in place there are just absolutely absurd. They allow no more than 10 people at the graveside, which means a large portion of the family couldn't even come. Everybody has to be masked and socially distanced, even though you're outdoors. You have to be 6 feet apart from the closest person to you.
And you're with people you live with, in most cases, right? It's people.
That's right.
Wow.
And if you're the pastor doing the service, you have to be masked, which makes it kind of hard for people who are hard of hearing to understand what you're saying. And that's ridiculous because you're outdoors on a hillside with the wind blowing.
Yeah, and the sun.
Yeah, that's right. And in the sun, the odds that you're going to get infected in a situation like that are virtually zero.
Right.
And yet oppressive rules like these have affected pretty much everything in our society. And the number of people who are all for it and think, this is great, we need to obey this, it boggles my mind.
There's a lot of churches that are trying to comply with social distancing guidelines, regulations. They're opening, but I don't know. Maybe they're following Newsom's guideline not to sing. But a lot of them
are just talk the lyrics.
But a lot of them are doing
you
like
are good. You are good. Oh,
you are a good father. But a lot of them are doing like the 6 feet apart, the masks, the 50% capacity, or whatever. But I noticed at Grace, it was very like not that.
Yeah,
is that intentional?
we just don't
or
have
is it something you just let people make their own decisions? And
yeah, no, everybody makes their own decision. If you want to socially distance on our campus, there are places where you can do that. But it would be physically impossible to get our entire congregation together and follow all of those rules. In fact, I'm writing a blog post that I hope to put up sometime this afternoon, answering some of those very questions. But I mentioned we have this massive circus tent set up in the parking lot, covers most of the parking lot. And we did the math on that. If you put the chairs 6 feet apart so that everybody is technically and properly socially distanced, it would only seat 400 people. That's less than one. I forget the fraction, but that's such a minor fraction of our congregation that it's totally impracticable to do that, and our people wouldn't put up with it. We need to be free to worship. That's the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution recognizes that is not a privilege granted to us by our government. It's a right it's an unalienable right given to us by God. So that's our argument, that Caesar has no authority to stop the power of God or limit it in such a draconian way. So we intend to continue doing what we've always done and what we're doing right now.